Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. The Bible is full of stories, and today's story is one that many of you are probably familiar with. It is a story of miraculous rescue from an otherwise deadly situation. Now, I don't know about you, but in my experience, if you throw somebody into a raging fire, they are probably going to die. At the very least, be badly burned. Now, before we get started, as you can see, I'm not wearing my robe. That's because the sanctuary is empty because we canceled church today. But I wanted to make sure that this sermon got put out there because next week we can only have so much time and the kids will be doing their program. So I realized I needed to get a sermon in here because it's Advent time. But before I get started, I encourage you to click on the link below and read the Bible text that I'm using for this sermon. Go ahead and pause the video, and I'll wait. Okay, now that you've all read the text for today, our reading for this morning comes to us from the book of Daniel. And if you're like most people, the only thing you know about the book of Daniel is the one story about Daniel in the lion's den. So let us say a little bit about the book of Daniel as a whole. The book of Daniel is an anonymous text named after its main character. Daniel is one of only two apocalypses in the Christian Bible. The other is the book of Revelation. And this is just a reminder that an apocalypse or apocalyptic literature, that's a genre of writing that reveals how the world is going to come to an end. And it often uses visions and mystical numbers and strange animals and supernatural mediators. While in our Bibles, Daniel is placed among the prophets, in Judaism, the book of Daniel is not considered a prophet, but it's one of what's called the writings. And it's placed between the books of Esther and Ezra. Now, chapter 1 through 6 of Daniel consists of what scholars call courtly tales. Stories that tell of intrigue, rivalry, and political machinations. Whereas chapters 7 through 12 contain the apocalyptic writings, the visions that Daniel has. Our reading for today is a courtly tale from that first section. These courtly tales deal with Jews living in a cosmopolitan empire, in this case Babylon, but later it will be Persia, and try to figure out how to live in it while being true to their Jewish faith. In today's reading, we hear a story about a group of 3 Jews who are brought to Babylon in the first deportation that occurred about 10 years before Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. Their names are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But the Babylonians renamed them to the names that we know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are working as government officials who are quite successful and well regarded. In fact, this particular courtly tale is referred to as a conflict tale because there is a group of Chaldean courtiers who are jealous of these 3. So they conspire against them and try to get them killed. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar has erected a large, gigantic, really golden statue and ordered that all people must fall down and worship it when they hear certain musical instruments are played, on the pain of death in a fiery furnace. This particular text has quite a bit of humor in it. It's a little hard to pick it up, but you just kind of have to roll with it. The dimensions of the statue are ridiculous. It's supposedly solid gold and 90 feet tall by 9 feet wide. One, there probably wasn't that much gold in all of Babylon. Remember that to this date, the entire amount of gold that has been mined in the world would fit in 2 Olympic swimming pools, and 2, it wouldn't have been able to stand. Its dimensions are unstable. Plus, this text implies that the whole court is ridiculous. We're given lengthy lists of government officials with exhaustive and amazing sounding titles, and we're told that each time there's a long list of musical instruments, ridiculously long, plays a song, all of the people are to fall down and worship the statue. And that exact language is used something like 4 times in this short reading, word for word. So basically we're told that the king and his entire empire is silly and ridiculous. The emperor is a buffoon. He's enamored with gold and flattery. And his court spends their time telling the king how amazing he is. But these jealous Chaldeans notice that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are not worshiping the statue as ordered, so they turn them in. And the king orders the 3 to appear before him. They defend themselves before the king. They're like, we have no choice. We are Jews. We need to follow our religious traditions. We will not worship your statue. And the king flies into a rage. He heats up the furnace 7 times hotter than normal and has them thrown in. And it's so hot that the people who throw them in there die from the heat. The king might be a buffoon, but he is still very dangerous. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are unharmed. Their clothes aren't even singed or even smell of smoke. The king asks them to come out of the furnace, and he praises their God. The king then praises Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego for refusing to obey his orders and instead staying true to their God. He even gives them a promotion. So the lesson of this text appears to be, stay true to your faith, and God will supernaturally protect you from any harm. And you'll even get to advance your career at the same time. But that's also the problem with this text, because we know that plenty of faithful people have stayed true to their faith, yet they weren't protected from harm. They did not prosper. In fact, Jesus, in his teaching, seems to indicate that suffering is a mark of being a follower of Jesus. And Jesus knew this as well. Jews, I should say, know this as well, because they've suffered for centuries under persecution from, lately it's mostly been Christians, sometimes suffering because of their faithfulness. And sure, there are the stories of miraculous salvation, but those don't happen very often. And most of the time, there is no miraculous rescue. Some might argue that this Bible story sets us up to be disappointed. And as I was reflecting on this text, that thought kept popping up into my mind. This isn't the way the real world works. And then I realized, well, the writer of this story must know that. And in fact, the original audience of this story would have known that too. They would have been painfully aware of the reality that good, faithful people suffer at the hands of powerful people. So what are we to make of this story? What is its use for us if it doesn't really reflect the reality of our world? And on top of that, our situation as Christians in the United States doesn't really match up with the Jews in this story. We're not a struggling minority, but the dominant group in this society. And we know that for the most part, our government will protect the rights of its white and Christian citizens. Now, that isn't necessarily the case for everybody, despite our Constitution guaranteeing freedom of religion, but our politicians all want to be seen as supporting Christians. And I think Thomas Jefferson was the only president to not officially profess Christianity, and that was over 200 years ago. So we're in a much different situation here. But even more so, we're left wondering, what does this text from Daniel say to us today? So this text, reflects a political situation very different from our own, and it also reflects a world where people are supernaturally rescued from harm. Well, what do we make of this story? Now, we might not regularly experience supernatural rescue, nor do we find ourselves in mortal peril due to our faith. But there are lessons that we can take away from this text. I think the biggest one is to take courage, to live boldly. And I think that's the lesson that the Jewish audience from back then would have gotten out of it as well. Sure, we can't really count on being supernaturally rescued, but we can be inspired by their example. We can be bold and live out our faith regardless of the consequences. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are models for imitation, people in a difficult situation who prevailed through faithful living. Can we expect to be supernaturally protected? No, but notice they also weren't. They explicitly tell the king that they might be killed in the furnace. But in spite of the fear of death, they remained true to their faith, and let us do the same. Well, how do we do that, you ask? Well, there are many possible options, and I don't have an infinite amount of time, but I'll give you an important example, because I think this is so important for us in this day and age. We, as Christians, are to live lives of love, loving everybody. Not just people who look like us, or think like us, or live near us. And now that's not popular these days. We're told there are people we should not love. But Jesus didn't tell us to only love some people. In Jesus' world, there were two groups of people. There are neighbors and there are enemies. And we're told to love both of them and treat them the same. In fact, you could take it further and say, really, for Jesus, there are no enemies. There are only neighbors. Now, the world will tell us that that is naive, but that is the very core of the gospel. People living together in community, loving one another despite being different, despite being traditional enemies of each other. And if we have trouble with that, well, we need to be honest with ourselves. If we find ourselves having a hard time loving somebody else for whatever reason, let's look inside of ourselves and realize that someone else almost certainly feels the same way about us. When I come across a person who I find, for whatever reason, unlovable, I stop myself, or undeserving, or in some ways they're lacking somehow. I stop myself and I realize that I'm not really any better than they are. And that's the thing we always need to remember. If we find ourselves standing in judgment over someone else, if we find ourselves standing against someone else and saying, I can't love you, you're not deserving because of X, Y, and Z, we need to be honest with ourselves. Look inside and say, wait a minute, am I really a better person than they are? Probably not. As much as we might think we're a good people, there are other people who know our dark side, either family members or community members, or someone who's crossed our path in the past who does not think good things about us. We need to remember that those people exist. We are not any better than those we think we are better than. When I come across a person I find unlovable, I stop myself and realize that I'm not really any better than they are. Now, I could also mention we live out our faith boldly by giving, by charitable giving to the church, to organizations that support those in need. And that includes not just your money, but your time and your talents. But that really just springs from our understanding of love, because in our tradition, love is not just a warm feeling that you have for someone else. It's a motivating impulse, an act on behalf of others. Love pulls us out of ourselves and pulls us into the world and has us act on behalf of people in ways that we didn't think we could, that we maybe thought were beyond our abilities. But love transforms us. Love makes us different. This story of Daniel about the fiery furnace can seem fantastical, right? In our everyday life, we don't have experiences where faithful people are thrown into a fiery furnace and miraculously are unharmed. That is not in our everyday experience for most of us. But this story points to something bigger, because like I said, even the original audience and the original author would have recognized that is actually not the way the world really works. But it is an inspiring story. It is a story that shows us what people can do in difficult circumstances. It shows us a story of three members of a marginalized group in a large cosmopolitan empire seeking to figure out how to live faithfully. And that is a question we all have to deal with all the time. How do we live faithfully in the world? And this story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego reminds us that we can live out faithfully, even if we're threatened with death. So go forth, live boldly with the example of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Amen.